Hello, this is Coach John, and welcome to my video series on sourcing high quality local foods. In this video series, my goal is to acquaint you, the listener, with the language of farming, as well as common practices across all levels, meaning conventional up through biodynamic farming, as well as the specific enterprises, both on animal agriculture and on produce, as well as grocery store standards and practices. My second goal is to empower you to feel confident meeting your farmer, asking questions, visiting and touring the farm, and understanding what you're looking at and what the farmer's actually practicing in their operation. And my third goal is to empower and to encourage you to grow as much of your own food as possible and to increase the level of connection with the food that you do have to purchase. The reason this is so important is because nobody's going to do a better job of raising food for you than you. At scale, you encounter a lot of issues with pests and management that you don't run into at small scales, and it will allow a higher level of quality. And I just feel it's important that we move to a more local food system so that we do interact with our food and we can see what's being done to the food, because at a national and international level, there's a lot of unsavory things that are being done to our food. And a lot of it is being done with, the greenwashing practices and other things that I'll get into in this video series. So a little bit about myself and why I feel qualified and called to share this information. Over the last couple of years, I've been involved in the food system on both the production and distribution end. I interned with Joel Salatin at Polyface Farm in Virginia in the summer of 2019. And following that experience, I was a butcher in the meat department at a major US grocery store for about 6 months. And following that experience, I apprenticed at a small organic diversified farm specializing in wholesale produce and grass-finished beef. We also raised pigs, dairy cows, laying hens, and I personally added meat birds to the menu during our final season there. Following that, I worked at a small family-owned produce stand during the summer and fall season, so I've got a little bit of insight on a local distribution level that's not through a grocery store. And my perspective on health comes from my training as a Check-Holistic lifestyle coach, which I've been practicing for the last 4 or 5 years. I did my training back in 2019. So I'd like to start with probably the most important part of this presentation. It's about label BS and greenwashing, and that organic is not everything. Labels often hide more than they say, and the biggest and most easiest way that I can point to that is pasture-raised beef versus grass-finished beef. We see this a lot. Pasture-raised beef is being sold at an extremely high price point in higher-end grocery stores, despite the fact that it's the same feedlot beef that you're getting at the lower end grocery stores like a Food Lion or even a Kroger. The commodity beef is pretty much the same across the board, whereas a grass finished cow must be finished on grass. And what that's doing is that's hiding the fact that all cows are raised on pasture. All cows are birthed on pasture. They are raised on pasture, but that doesn't tell you about the quality of the pasture that they're raised on. Conventional cattle are raised in a very large field. The grass never gets above, 2 or 3 inches in height. And they spend all of their time in the same field, not leaving where they're pooping and not giving the pasture any time to rest. Whereas grass finished beef can be a similar thing. I believe that they can also be finished on hay, and that still counts as 100% grass-fed, grass-finished, which is fine. But with this whole pasture-raised versus grass-finished thing is that those are two labels, and they point to two different things, and yet within the label, there is a stratification of quality that is lost, and you can have junk and really high quality food sold at the same price point and sold as this amazing, beautiful thing. On the low end, you can have 100% grass-fed, grass-finished beef. They stand in the same field. They're munching on 2-inch stubble, and they're fed hay when they need it. And that's grass-fed, grass-finished, 100%. That's awesome. Sold for $35 a pound for the filet mignon, whatever. Or you can have a tightly managed rotational grazing system, even with finishing pasture. So they're rotating 1 time a day, 2 times a day. It's very clean. They're eating only the best, most nutritious grass when it's fresh. And they're finishing in a field with grass with seed heads on it to develop a higher fat content, or they're possibly being slaughtered during the spring when the nutrients are at their highest, or during the fall when they've got the most fat on them. There's really a stratification within that label that is lost in the label. So that's why it's more important to meet and to know your farmer that is selling you your meat. There's also with eggs, you have straight up eggs. Then you have the cage-free certification, free range, outdoor access, pasture raised, and now even recently I'm seeing the regenerative certification on some eggs. And while I do like to see that, I do find some hesitancy with putting, a regenerative label on something that's produced at a national level, because that creates loopholes. And regenerative ag is something that's near and dear to my heart. That's why I got into farming, because we do need to regenerate our land and build topsoil and practice farming in a way that's not only sustainable but will get better over time. And I do believe that falls under the regenerative label, but I've not been able to really get into how they're structuring this label of regenerative. So with eggs, you have laying hens that are just sitting in a house in a cage. They're fed and watered, and they never get out to stretch their legs. They never see the sun. It's pretty dismal conditions. Cage free means that they're in those same houses, no sunlight, terrible food, terrible water, cramped, but at least they're not caged, so they can rub elbows with the other 120,000 hens that are in the same house as them. Free range, to my knowledge, means that these hens have a little bit of space outdoors. If I'm not mistaken, outdoor access means they have an equal amount of space to outdoor space as well as indoor, so they can get some sunlight, but that doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the food or any other living condition as far as antibiotics or anything else that the chickens are being raised. At the pasture raised level, hens are on pasture, thankfully, and they're getting sunlight, hopefully, as well as fresh grass if they're rotated. Um, I've not seen any pasture raised hens that are just cooped up on grass. I mean, eventually it turns into just a wasteland underneath, but there's stratification in the pasture raised label based on stock density and how much land the chickens have access to ensure cleanliness of the the habitat and what they're eating. This label BS also applies with grass-fed butter, real 100% grass-fed butter. I'd be surprised if it really exists. Um, I, I don't know how you could maintain a Jersey dairy cow. Jerseys are the ones that I have the most experience with, and they put out the most butter fat, so they're highly desirable for making butter. Um, it's pretty impossible to keep weight on them without some sort of heavy supplemental calories like grains. Uh, and even if they're not getting fed grains explicitly from the farmer, they're still going to be eating grains. So there's really no grain-free cow. It's just there's a difference between corn and soy and wheat and these other things that are in the standard commodity food that we're feeding to cows, and let's say a orchard grass or a timothy seed head that is a grain. Grains are seeds of grasses which a cow will eat when it's the right season. I mean, in my experience with rotational grazing, I was able to get seed heads on some of the grass, and our dairy cow, when she was moved to the paddock, instead of walking in with her head down, finding the good grass at her feet, she walked in with her head up and was using her tongue to kind of lasso the seed heads and strip the seeds because they're a higher caloric content. And that's what they're looking for. So a truly grain-free cow is pretty impossible to find, but let's just focus on what grains they are eating. Then we've got the homegrown, beyond organic, all natural, farm fresh. You see this a lot in the local sphere, smaller time farmers, people that sell locally that are not in wholesale at all, more family oriented farms will use these types of labels, and they don't really tell you much about what the farmer's actually doing. So I'm going to take each one of them head on and share a little bit of my perspective on them. So homegrown doesn't tell you anything. Homegrown is, okay, this food is grown at our home. And I'd be amazed if there's any farmer that doesn't live on their farm or the land that they're growing the food that sells at a local level. When you get into national level commodity producers, yeah, they probably rent thousands of acres or own thousands of acres that they don't live on. So, all right, that stuff's not homegrown. But the people that are producing at a local level, they generally live, work, and eat from the land that's all the same piece of land. So that doesn't tell you a thing about, are they spraying pesticides and herbicides, how they're managing pests, what's their fertility methods. It doesn't tell you anything. Beyond organic is typically used by people, in my experience, that are unwilling or unable to meet the organic standard, and yet they're trying to say, like, well, we have a better product, we're just not certified. Some people, like David Sturman in St. Ignatius, Montana, this guy produces the best beef. He's, in his own words, the laziest farmer, and he tries to find systems that are cheap, that are effective, and produce a high quality product, and with minimal input from him. And he finds that the natural, no chemical inputs and rotational grazing and even minimal water inputs are the way that he does it. And he's someone that I would say is beyond organic, but doesn't get his beef certified because it's difficult to get an organic certification on a slaughterhouse. However, in, let's say, poultry production, I see a lot of people that raise their birds on pasture, and they're getting a lot of sunlight, they're moving often, but they're being fed non-GMO crops or non-GMO feed, I'm sorry, and they're being sprayed with Roundup or other pesticides and herbicides. And while I really encourage and support people raising their chickens out on grass with sunlight, moving often, that's awesome, but that's not beyond organic. Organic more often is pointing to the chemicals that are used in the production of that food. The presence of pesticides and herbicides is actually not even um, the sole focus of organic, because there are some that are approved for organic use. So beyond organic may be people that are doing things chemical free outside of their feed. So you really want to ask about, like, well, what kind of feed are you feeding to your chickens or your ducks or even your dairy cow? All natural typically just means that it's no synthetic ingredients, which, I mean, if you're a human being and you're eating food, your food should not have synthetic ingredients in it. Natural flavors, uh, in my opinion, are a synthetic ingredient and should not be in your food. But this is really something that I see applied more to processed foods, um, or occasionally a grain salesman. I'll ask if their grain is certified organic when I'm looking for poultry feed, and they'll say, "Oh, well, it's all natural." It's okay, great. Um, and even times that's not even the case, that it's not all natural, because they're using a synthetic vitamin supplement in the chicken feed. So that's just something I look out for. Typically, people will say it's all natural to kind of make it sound good, but it doesn't mean anything. There's no certification process behind it. It's more pointing to, we don't overtly use synthetic ingredients, although some people are not aware that they're using synthetic ingredients in their poultry feed, for example. Farm fresh, again, doesn't really tell you much at the local level. Like, if you're going to a farmer's market, the food there should be fresh. Ideally, it would have been harvested that morning or perhaps the previous day. We'll get into transportation of foods later on in this presentation, but the fresher the food is, the better it tastes, the more nutritious it is. And if you're buying food at the local level at a farmer's market or directly from the farm, uh, that is going to be farm fresh. And that's wonderful, but it doesn't tell you anything about what are the inputs and what are the practices that they're using on their farm. That's something you really want to look out for. Again, it's a feel good word that is not telling you anything about the actual quality of the product other than how fresh it is. And freshness, okay, that is a quality that we do look for, but uh it's not saying anything about inputs and management. So in the next video, I'll get into grocery store standards and practices. This is mostly informed from my personal experience in a major grocery store. A lot of not great stuff, a lot of stuff to watch out for. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.